Welcome to the study of Esther. This is going to be a 7-week study, and I am extremely excited that we are going to be looking at this book. I think this scripture is probably one kind of underrated scripture. People don't study it very often. It's even kind of hard to find in the Old Testament. But to me, this book is just filled with some amazing challenges for us as the people of God. And so I'm excited that you are going to be on the journey with us over the next weeks as we dig into this word together. The Book of Esther is a story about a young Jewish woman who finds herself kind of in the right place at the right time to be used by God to protect the people of God. And we're going to talk about that in more detail. I would also say that the Book of Esther is a story about looking back and seeing where God has been working, where he has been in our lives, where he has, maybe you didn't feel him, maybe you didn't think that he was there. But one of the things that I think is easy for us as people is if we don't feel like he is responding right away, if we don't feel like he's doing something, then we question if he's even there. But one of the things that we as the people of God need to do sometimes is look back and see and evaluate where God has been working, where he's been putting those pieces together, where he has acted in our lives. And sometimes we've just missed it because we've been so busy. I also think this book is a book about faith and about trust. I think this is a book about the fact that God is a God who is big enough and who always has the best for his people. He's always looking out for us. He always wants to protect us, and he wants to fulfill his promise, even in the most unlikely of places and even with the most unlikely of people. So as we open this story, as we look at this scripture more closely, one of the really important things we need to do is we need to stop before we dig into chapter 1, and we need to kind of orient ourselves with place and time. And so that's what we're going to do in our first kind of week together. And as a studier of the Old Testament, specifically, I've fallen in love with the Old Testament. One of the things that's a hurdle for us is the fact that Scripture is filled with culture and nuances that we don't understand because it was so long ago. And so to some degree, we have to be historians. We have to be people who are willing to dig into the people and the place of the time so that we can pull out the richness of Scripture. And I found this to really be the case when I took an Old Testament class in seminary, and my professor, Dr. Richter, was really, really passionate about making sure that you take time to understand time and place and culture. So this is what we're gonna do. And what we're first gonna do is we're gonna kind of look at the literary form of the Book of Esther because it is so unique. What's interesting about the Book of Esther is that its identity and kind of genre is really hard to pin down. You could consider it to be a historical account, like Kings or like Chronicles. But really, much of the facts that are found in the Book of Esther are not really lining up with historical facts that we can find about the people of God during this time period, or even about the Persians, which are they're huge players within this story. So that really doesn't help us very much, so it's hard to say that this is a book of history. One of the other things that you could say is that this is a book that is considered to be a set of royal court stories, which was a really popular kind of way of telling a story. You would take an actual event or an actual person, but you'd add a ton of things that never really happened to the story. And it made it really fun to listen to, but it didn't necessarily mean that it was completely true. Although most of the time there was kind of a theme that wove through that the teller was trying to get the people to or to understand. It could be seen as apocryphal work, and we're going to talk about that again a little bit later, which also means that it was kind of a novel kind of story told in the Second Temple time, specific to kind of a comical way of telling a story. And this definitely is more of a satire story. We're going to see tons of irony. We're going to see tons of kind of comedic things that happen within the story. So in some ways, I would say this is the literary genre of Esther. Then there's this one other way that we could look at this as a literary kind of book, and this is that it is a secular character kind of book. One of the most interesting things about the Book of Esther is that it contains absolutely no direct reference to Yahweh at all. There's no direct prayers. There's no sacrifice of any religious observance. There's allusions to Yahweh, but nothing very clear. One of the most unusual things in regard to this is that this story kind of came out of a time where ancient Near Eastern literature was filled with religious literature. But God seems to lurk in some way everywhere within the background of this story. What could be interpreted as coincidence to many, to a listening Jew, would be considered God's providence and his plan and his hand. So as a literary book, this Book of Esther is kind of hard to define, and I think that's one of the other reasons that it's so interesting to study. Also, the author of this book is completely unknown. Like the book of Ruth, it is named after the main heroine of the story, but we don't know who originally penned this story at all, and really in some ways maybe what their original intent was. Okay, so now let's move to the history and the context of our story. We're going to move kind of to a global start. And we're going to talk about the main characters of our story. That's the Persians and the Israelites. So we'll start with the Persians. The Persian people started as a kind of small nomadic tribal group of people. This tribe spanned all areas of the Indo-Europe kind of area, but it was really kind of hard to pinpoint exactly where they came from because they were a nomadic group, so they kind of moved around a lot. They're not much of consequence. They're not really even mentioned until they grow pretty significantly. But they do over time grow until this one guy named Cyrus becomes the tribal leader of this kind of little nomadic tribe. And he decides that he's tired of he and his people kind of being the slaves of other groups of people that come in and take this land. Now, they're settled as a whole in what we call Mesopotamia. And they were tired of being taken over by other groups. And so Cyrus says, we're going to expand, and we're going to expand our nomadic boundaries. We're going to conquer areas. We're going to become a military tribe who is going to take power and authority. Eventually, Cyrus, who is really a great leader, becomes this Persian group. They grow in size and eventually overthrow the largest tribe in the area, and that would be the Medes and the Babylonians. And they had settled in all of Mesopotamia. And they are to the northern region of our people's land, the Promised Land. In just around 30 years of defeating the Babylonians, the empire grows in huge magnitude. In fact, the Persian Empire stretches from India in the east to Greece on the kind of the Mediterranean, down to Egypt and Ethiopia, and then north to what is now Russia. So if you can imagine in your mind's eye how huge that territory is that the Persians have taken over. And everyone in those areas at that point have become subservient to the Persian people. Interestingly, though, one of the things about Cyrus is that he was not like the Assyrians or the Babylonians, where he believed that the best way to control those under his power and authority was to put huge fear into them. He was one who believed the best way to deal with people is to allow them their cultural freedom, as long as they stayed within the guidelines of his rules of government. And one of the biggest things for him was the idea of paying taxes. So really, Persia became this melting pot of an area with tons of different languages, tons of cultures still being practiced, tons of religions and gods being worshipped. And he was okay with that, and the Persians were okay with that, as long as they followed the rule of the Persians. Eventually, he died, and the next one in line was, the next king in line was King Darius. And King Darius was really significant because he did two really big things within his time as king. The first one was that he created these things called satraps, which are what we would consider kind of local governors, a way for him to kind of keep all of these different cultures and people kind of controlled and make sure they were still doing the things that they needed to do so his rule can continue to be powerful. He also created tons of highways, which it wasn't that there weren't any highways around the time, but because his area was so large, it was important that he could travel and get information out as quickly as possible. So he created all of these really intricate highways from city to city to city so that people could travel quickly so his edicts could get out, things that he proclaimed among his empire. And this was a huge deal because we're going to see this within the story of Esther. In fact, it plays a pretty significant role in itself. So from there, King Darius does one other thing. At least he starts it, and then the following kings kind of continue it. Since this area was so large, they set up two capital cities, and they would winter in one and summer in the other. And the first one was Persepolis, hard words here, which was really the summer capital, and that was because it was totally covered in snow in the winter time. And then Susa was the other capital, and that's where they would be during the winter. And they were kind of mirrors of each other. In fact, the palaces looked almost identical to each other. And the Persians were really big about architecture. They were really big about garden, their land looking beautiful. And again, this is something that we're going to see in our story, kind of the splendor of the Persian people. They took really a lot of pride in how they presented their capital, how they presented their palace, how they presented their government space. And that's going to, again, play a role in our story. Between King Darius, there were believed to be kind of about 8 other kings before Darius II kind of came onto the scene. And then after him was a king named Artaxerxes V. And he is the one who is defeated by Alexander the Great. And now Alexander the Great was the one who ends the Persian rule and begins the Greek rule. And this is important because one of the problems with the kind of Persian history is that the Persians were really not good about recording their history. In fact, we have more Greek historians who record Persian history than we do Persians. So we'll see as we study this book and as we talk about the history of Persia that it's a little bit skewed because the Greeks are telling the story, which would be if I was telling a story and it wasn't really about me, I'm going to miss some details or I'm going to highlight it more about myself or something like that. And so the Greeks have a tendency to make the Persians look frivolous and kind of dumb and like they're all about money and themselves. And to some degree that may have been true, but because the Greeks are telling the story, they're going to paint their enemy in a vastly different light. Now we need to talk about the Israelites. Now the Israelites obviously are our people, the people of God, and they were living in the southern kingdom. If you remember, the northern kingdom had been destroyed by the Assyrians. We had lost 10 of the 12 tribes of Judah, and down in the southern kingdom are our last two. And eventually the kings of the people of God ignored God and his word, and they did what they wanted, and the people did what they wanted. And so the Babylonians came, and they defeated the people of God in 587, and they carted them off to their land in Mesopotamia to become servants and to live, and really more than anything, not to live in their promised land. So the people live in Mesopotamia and under the Babylonians' rule for about 70 years. And they adapt to life as refugees in that area. And they hope and they pray and they talk to God about when he will save them and when they will be able to go home. And some probably lose hope over those 70 years. Some hold fast to the hope that God had a plan and he hears them. But they kind of ingrain themselves over that time into this new land. Now, when Cyrus comes on the scene and he defeats the Babylonians, one of the things that he does is he writes an edict that the Israelites, whoever wants to, can return down to the promised land. Remember, Cyrus is a king who would prefer to make friends instead of enemies. Even though he is the ruler of the Israelites, he decides it would be better for him, ultimately, and he would get more out of them if he allowed them to go back home. But only a small portion of the people of God return to the promised land to rebuild. A majority of them stay in this area and live and mix in with the Persian people. In this time, there is rebuilding of the people of God, but in this time of the Persian leadership is our story of Esther. Because many return to the Holy Land and there are still many living in Mesopotamia, there's obviously still many Israelites who are living in the Persian capitals. And our story takes place in the Persian capital of Susa. And our heroine, who is an Israelite girl, will teach us some amazing things about the people of God and about God himself. So here we are in kind of a time and a place that we can't really pinpoint. In fact, as we read the story of Esther, we're going to come in contact with so many issues about history, so many things that kind of can't be proven, that so many people ask the question, why is this book even in our scripture? What does it have to do? It doesn't mention God directly. It seems to not even be true. So why would this story be chosen to be in our Bible now? Well, this is why we are studying this book. One of the things that we note about this book is that the Jews are a people of God who are under threat. And really the threat has more to do with personal antagonism than a permanent national issue. It's not about what the Israelites have been doing, how they have disrespected the Persians. Ultimately, it's about one man's frustration with one other man who happens to be an Israelite. And that's kind of the craziness about this story. The writing style doesn't line up with the way that the Persians wrote or even the way that history was recorded at the time. There's elements of fiction and untruth, but I read this quote once as I was kind of studying through this story, and it really hit me, and I've continued to think about it over and over and over again. So I challenge you as you read this story to kind of think about, how does truth manifest itself in fictional writing? It's not really about the absence of truth, but about the vehicle for truth. So while there may not be a ton of true facts within the book of Esther. The story takes us to a place where we recognize more of who God is. So we may have to dig a little bit. We may have to sit back and ask ourselves, God, what are you saying to us? But the truth of who God is still there. Now, during this time period, we're going to place our Esther under the king Ahasuerus. These are hard names, in history. Now, it's not completely proven that this is when the story could have happened, but this is kind of where we're going to stick. That means that our time period is really between, let me find my notes to make sure that I say it correctly, because it is a huge time frame, and I have lost it. I'll come back to it. But this is one of the reasons that it's difficult. One of the other reasons that this story is so difficult is because the story is about a Jewish woman who becomes a queen of an empire, which is far-fetched. And it was far-fetched because Persian kings only married other royal people from other courts for more power. They wouldn't marry an unknown Israelite girl. This is part of the irony and the interest of the story. Now, I have to tell you, Jewish people love the story of Esther. In fact, tons of hard copies of this book survived from the Middle Ages. More copies of this book were out there than the whole of the Old Testament books. Often it is said that Esther ranks second in importance only to the Torah. And the Torah was the law of God revealed to Moses and recorded in the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scripture. So it's number 2, and was more widely copied than any other book of the Old Testament. That should tell you something about how the Israelites viewed this particular story. Now, some would also say the very opposite about this story. Some would say that many Jews were quite embarrassed by this book because of its complete lack of God mentioned anywhere in the story. It seems so secular by nature and even has all of these threads of vengeance in it. And so while there are so many Jewish people that love this story, there are almost the same amount of people who say this is a horrible story because it doesn't talk about God, because it has these themes of hate and vengeance. But to me, the beauty of that is it paints a picture of the reality of our world. We're people who are going to deal with hate. We're people who are going to come up against things like seeing other cultures and other people and being mad and feeling just when someone does us wrong, and then we should do something back. This is what the story is about. But because the people of God, so many really celebrate this book, Esther is read during every Purim. And Purim is also known as the Festival of Lots, which is a huge Jewish holiday that commemorates this particular story, the saving of the Jewish people from Haman, who is our villain within the story. In fact, in the Book of Maccabees, it is called Mordecai's Day. And if you know anything about Maccabees, Maccabees is one of the writings that is found in the Apocrypha. And one of the interesting things about this particular book of Esther is that it is one of very few that's found within our Protestant Bible, and also found within the Apocrypha, or kind of the Catholic side of the Bible. And there are extra chapters of the book of Esther in the Apocrypha, and we're going to kind of talk about maybe why that is and how it kind of informs the story as we go through our time together. According to the Book of Esther, when the people of God were saved from genocide, Esther declared that it be a day of feasting and rejoicing, and they have taken that to be true over time. It is a day of celebration where they wear masks and costumes. There's public celebration, parades, eating, drinking, and their reading of the Book of Esther, complete reading, all 10 chapters. It's celebrated on the Hebrew calendar on the 14th, or on the 15th day of the month of Adar. And today, Jerusalem still, a large amount of people still in Jerusalem celebrate this day. It is reminiscent of the Passover, except where the Passover is considered to be kind of a solemn celebration. This day is considered to be a huge celebratory party time for the people of God because they had been saved. God had remembered them. He had made a plan. So as we jump into the actual chapters of Esther within the next weeks, I want you to keep these facts of time and space in mind. They're going to be really important in how we read and interpret Scripture. And they're going to help us to paint a much bigger picture that reveals the powerful things of God. Each week, I'm going to give you a few reflection questions to help you continue the process of kind of digging through this story and discovering more of God. And those will come at the end of our teaching time. Next week, we're going to jump into chapter 1 and 2. So if you have the time between now and then, I really encourage you to sit down and read both chapters. Write down a few questions you may have, a few words or phrases that don't make sense, some things that pop out to you or are really unfamiliar, and to continue to ask yourself, where do I see God in this story? And remember, he's not blatantly written into the story. We're not going to see things that say, and God said, or this person prayed directly to God. But God is there. So ask yourself, where is he in the story? How is he shaping and molding the people who are a part of this story? And in the midst of that, what is he saying to us? So I hope to see you next week as we dig into chapter 1 and chapter 2.